Welcome to the Festival of the Future City, run by Bristol Ideas. Events this year are both online and in person. The full programme can be found on the Bristol Ideas website, and you'll see the link below this video. I'm Peter Madden. I'm Professor of Practice in City Futures at Cardiff University. I'll be guiding the discussion today. And joining me is Dan Hill, urbanist, designer, and he's Director of Strategic Design at Vinnova, the Swedish Innovation Agency. Also, you're a professor, visiting professor at UCL. Also, welcome Antonella Radicchi. She's an architect, academic. She works at the Technical University of Berlin, and she created the Hush City app. Welcome, Antonella. So we'll be discussing how cities will sound in the future, and can we orchestrate our urban soundscapes to work better for everyone. Sound is a fundamental component of our cities, of their vibrancy, of their well-being, of the health of our citizens, of urban identity. But too often they're overlooked by planners and designers. So we'll be looking at about how we as humans shape sound in our cities, and how in return our cities shape our sound experience and the noise and the urban experience that we have. And we'll be looking to the future and into how that might change. So start off, Dan, with a question for you. Why is sound so important in cities, and also why is it so often overlooked by designers and planners?
It's a great question. I think there's something very useful about sound, and to help us think about cities more broadly, actually, because I think it's, as you describe in your introduction, it's kind of fundamentally to do with our health and well-being, and so it's genuinely fundamental in the almost medical sense, the technical sense, all of those kind of questions, and at the same time, it's culture. So it's to do with cultural expression and identity and the spirit of a place, and all of these non-technical questions as well. So as with cities generally, there are kind of a combination of infrastructures and technical questions, and then on top of that, a sort of cultural questions. And I think we often get those the wrong way around. As you know, Peter, cities are often run as if they're a set of technologies and infrastructures, and they're engineering questions and quite a technocratic approach to city governance. And that misses the whole point of cities to some extent, which is about culture, which is about bringing people together to create things, to create identity, to be with each other. And so sound's very useful like that, because it keeps on repeatedly reminding us that it's to do with culture and identity and place and these kind of ambiguous questions and uncertain questions. And I think that's why planners and the more technocratic trades really struggle with it. It's everything they hate. It's ambiguous, uncertain, it constantly moves. It's produced by people and place in unpredictable ways. So you have to keep paying attention to it. And that's something that the city governance systems aren't really built for. And architects have been sort of dragged along with that. Architects are very comfortable with sound, but the context of their work is usually tell us about the engineering and make sure that the building stands up, and then we won't need to return to it for a while. Whereas actually sound keeps dragging us back into that question.
And as you said, a huge impact on well-being and health of our citizens. It's like the forgotten pollutant, isn't it, noise? So, Antonella, you've worked a lot on sound in cities and how it contributes to our urban experience. You know, why do you think people ignore it, and how is it important to health?
Thank you so much for the question. It's in fact a very relevant one, and we know that sound can be a health hazard, and the World Health Organization has pointed this out recently. And in fact, long exposure to noise can have negative effects on our health, causing cardiovascular diseases, cognitive impairments, annoyance, sleep disturbance, of course. And it's imperative reducing noise in order to protect our health and well-being. And this is something that cannot be discussed, especially if we look at the data. And the European Environmental Agency says that 100 more than 100,000 million Europeans are affected every year by high levels of traffic noise. And these figures are designated to increase in the next years. This means that actions really need to be taken. On the other hand, as Dan mentioned, sound is also a resource. It's a vital component for our lives. We use sound to communicate through languages. Think about the power of music or the power of natural sounds to positively impact on our health and well-being. The access to quiet areas is another hot topic, of course. And what I really would like to see more is using sound as a creative means to redesign and replan our cities.
Well, that's a brilliant challenge. And so why, just to finish this idea, why do people, it's so important, and obviously certain people experience noise and bad sound and much more than other segments of the population, and why do you think people have got it? You know, as it's part of our identity, it's the auditory cues that help us navigate the world and cities, and people just seem to be allowing this cacophony of noise to explode in our ears and to assault us, instead of using it as a resource, as you say. Either of you, how could we use that to design better places, better cities?
Would you like to, Antonella?
Oh, yes, sure. We can use sound as a means to redesign and plan our cities in many different ways and at different levels. I would like to share a couple of examples. Yeah. For the planning scale, for example, we can design mobility plans, which can be very effective in creating oases of quietness and oases of high environmental quality. An example is the mobility plan made by the city of Barcelona. The idea in Barcelona is to group several blocks to create a super block, which is usually close to the main road traffic, and give the street space back to people. So if we look at the figures, they're very much impressive. They have reached an increase in public life, nearly 90%, and a decrease in air and noise pollution, nearly 38%. Of course, here there is also the problem of where these super blocks are located, which parts of the city, which kind of communities benefit from these kind of interventions. We don't really want that, access to quietness, for example, is only for privileged people or for healthy groups of people. But the idea should be that the access to quietness, for example, is something negotiated at the city level involving all the social groups. Another example that we can discuss today is the placemaking level. So we can use, for example, several components of the urban environment, like water features, in order to, on the one hand, mask background noises, on the other hand, improve the acoustic quality of public spaces. And if we look at the examples of New York City pocket parks, we can find very nice water features installations. However, here I would recommend caution is needed, because water can in fact mask background noises and enhance the acoustic quality of places, but only if it's acoustically designed in order to address specific frequencies. And in this line of reasoning, I would highly recommend to go for integrated approaches in design and planning. So building up interdisciplinary teams with designers, architects, planners, and acousticians, acoustic designers, and possibly also artists.
So Dan, you also think about street design and place in your work in Sweden, and how does sound come into that?
I think in the way that Antonella just described, it helps us it helps us think about how to do things in an integrated way that solve for culture and nature, conviviality, humanity, all at the same time. And underlying your question, your earlier question as to why don't we address this? I think we know it's the same reason that we haven't addressed the environment generally within cities. They've been run by relatively narrow sets of concerns around economic development and so on. So the building industry and the car industry have shaped cities rather more than say the urban design and architecture or communities that Antonella was talking about. So we're trying to reverse that completely, actually. And the projects we're doing here are really letting the street design the street. So it's kind of coming from the street up. And then you can have a conversation on each individual street, actually, about the character of that street. And that can be the aural character of it. So what does it sound like? But equally, it's what mobility is at play there? How much greenery is there? How much of it is a park versus a car park? You know, those are the kind of questions you can really work through in a very participative way. It's really not rocket science, but it does mean a 180-degree shift in the way that we think about what streets or places are about. So just to be really super specific, we're looking at the relationship between reducing car traffic noise, increasing bird song. And if you increase bird song, and particularly diversity of bird species, that's a direct impact on mental health, a direct impact on physical health, and how people recuperate from sicknesses and illnesses, which would be quite handy right now. Those things are the same thing. So biodiversity, sound, they're all utterly interwoven, but they don't usually make it to the table as the thing that you drive the street design around. If you flip it and put people at the heart of that question and the place at the heart of that question, we find those things come out very quickly indeed.
Yeah, I mean, nature really important. We want sounds of nature in our cities, and nature doesn't want our sounds. So we need to get that right. But when you design the streets, whose noise, whose sound? Because sound is very contested also in our cities, between neighbours, between cultures, different people that have a sense of what is a good sound. You know, banging beats for one person is terrible headache noise for someone else. So how do you work out whose soundscapes we should create in cities?
I think it's the same question as to whether you have a car parking space or a bike parking space, to be honest. It has to be negotiated through. It means people talking to people. It means neighbors talking to neighbors. And we talk here about this kind of 1 minute city idea, as in the street outside your front door, your immediate neighborhood, which you have a very intimate relationship with. You know the guy that runs the bar on the corner. You know the people in the kindergarten. You know your neighbors. That's the unit that you can have that conversation at, because sound is so specific, as you say. So if it's a street with a kindergarten on it, it's going to be defined by the sound of young children running out at 3 p.m. I mean, it's going to happen. So you have to be aware that needs to come out. A street 2 blocks away can be, as you say, completely driven by the nightclub that's there or the venue that's there. But it's really super local. And that's the only way I think of approaching this, from the street up as opposed from the top down. There's a lovely project that's briefly in Malmö, which is just beginning to get going in the south of Sweden. And it's a new development, or rather it's an existing industrial area called Sofielund. And they've just created now something called a kulturljudzone, which is a culture sound zone, which recognizes that the place for a long time has been defined by industrial noises. And now actually it's moving into more sort of cultural venues and clubs and bars and gigs and things like that. And they're using that as a sense to designate that kind of sound, which actually means that it's not going to be an area dominated by housing. Because if you start introducing housing into these areas, as you know, it very quickly becomes, well, we can't have that kind of noise here because it's a housing dominated zone. And then everything becomes dragged down to the level of what's appropriate for a suburban environment. And what we're trying to see, well, the city actually is quite bumpy in terms of its sound wave. There are some areas that should be noisy, and this is being thought of as a culture noise zone. And there are some that necessarily need to be quiet. And that dynamic is like a piece of music. That's far more interesting than a piece of music if it was just the same volume all the way across.
Absolutely. We don't want silent cities, and we want the noise to be part of the identity. So, Antonella, is there good noise in cities, and how do we capture that? How do we understand it, and how do we encourage it?
That's the question, I would say. Yeah, as Dan mentioned, it should be something really negotiated and discussed with people who live and work in our cities. It's not. There is apparently not a win-win solution. But if we look at the data, for example, that people collected using Hush City, we can find nevertheless some patterns, at least in the way people perceive quietness in cities. Made some comparative analysis using data collected by people in Berlin and in other cities like Granada, Barcelona, or Singapore, and it looks like that there are these kind of patterns. So in fact, quiet areas are not defined by silence or the absence of silence, but are defined by the composition of different sounds coming from nature, of course, from vegetation, water features, but also from human people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I did a sound walk with that app as well. A great app, Hush City app. So everyone download it. You can map sounds in your city, and it's not about decibels. The traffic noise was high and very, very annoying. But the school playground and the noise of kids shouting and having fun at playtime was a lovely sound. It was much louder than the traffic sound. Seagulls flying ahead. We've got a lot of water in Bristol, and some people find them annoying, but it's part of the character. The bells of St. Mary Redcliffe Church ringing out. There's sounds in the city that we want to preserve and enhance, and other ones we don't. So looking at the negative sounds, maybe Dan, motor traffic is one of the big ones in cities and one of the most damaging. So thinking about how technology is going to change in the future, we know there's going to be massive changes. How will that change sound in the city and our experience of this?
Yeah, I think you wrote a very good piece about sound in the city, Peter, and you talk about this. About halfway through, you talk about the shift to sort of electrifying everything that's happening, and I think that we absolutely right. There is this sort of electrifying everything agenda happening for very good reasons. At the same time, as we know, when it comes to mobility, just electrifying our diesel fleet of cars and making them electric cars will just create other problems. So it becomes a question of lithium-ion batteries and whether ending up in the world somewhere else, as opposed to perhaps sort of carbon emissions at the tailpipe instead. But it's still a massive problem. So as I said earlier, if we solve for sound or we think about sound, we're also beginning to think about nature and much broader systems as well. So I think we could look at we need to look at electrifying vehicles, but two things. One is that once you get over about 40 kilometers an hour in an electric vehicle, the sound is exactly the same as a diesel vehicle, because it's basically the tire noise on the street. It's things like that. It's not really the engine that's causing the problem there. So the sound damage is precisely the same with electric vehicles, unless you slow them right down, which we need to do anyway for reasons of safety and environment and all of the things that would go along with that. And the second thing, again, is that we also need to radically reduce the number of such vehicles in the city in the first place, because that enables streets to breathe, enables other activities, it enables biodiversity properly in the first place. And we begin to solve for the battery problem, because we can't, again, just do a one-to-one replacement of hundreds of millions of cars, 100 millions of electric vehicles. It's not really going to solve the problem. So either way, we're talking about slowing down and reducing by many orders of magnitude the number of cars in cities. Possibly, one could argue 70% reduction in the amount of private car use, for instance, and similar amounts in terms of lorries and traffics. So there's still a presence in the city, but then one actor, and maybe a convivial actor, that's not dominating the soundscape and then not dominating the biosphere. And that's the interesting thing about sound, is it quickly gets us into those kinds of questions about much broader connected systems, I think.
Yeah, and of course, electric vehicles, when they're going very slowly now, they have to have a sound. It seems like such a shame we've got rid of traffic noise, and for safety reasons, we have to put noise back into the city. So what do you think about that? And can we use those kind of noises we need to create to make our city work? Can we use them more intelligently?
Yeah, absolutely. And I do wonder if some of that's a bit of a red herring, though, or whatever the oral equivalent of that is in, remember when cars were introduced into cities in the first place, we had to have a man with a red flag walking in front of them. And then, within about 10 years, people kind of get used to them for a while, at least until they begin to dominate the space. So I think, as with bikes, if you slow the vehicles down to something like between 15 and 25, 30 kilometers an hour, if we're moving at that speed, I think it's less of an issue. The sound is an issue, or rather the lack of sound is an issue if the car is going really fast in the first place and there's no chance to react and it's dominating the space again. So again, it comes back to slowing things down. There is an opportunity, though, to be a bit more thoughtful about then what sound it might make. I remember the artist Brian Eno talking about, wouldn't it be interesting, this was before electric cars, if the horn in a car had like sort of different characters to it, so you could send different signals to people in the street. If you saw your friend, you could send a message from the car horn. So you do start thinking about, well, it would be absurd to have an electric car faking the noise of a diesel car just because we're used to that. It's missing all kinds of possibilities about the character of sound. And I think rather more of the subway system in Tokyo, where every line has a different audio signature. So when you go through the ticket barriers, it plays a little tune in a very Tokyo kind of way. But the green line is different to the blue line, is different to the yellow line, because they're different places. So we could use sound to describe character and identity. Absolutely.
So Antonella, thinking about how technology might make us understand sound better and use it better. Obviously, data will understand patterns of sound and the impacts much more. But is there any other ways you think we can use technology to make our cities better in an auditory sense?
I would like to touch on the question was also discussed by Dan about electric vehicles and this kind of sounds, because what I really see is missing nowadays is a kind of inclusive debate about the sounds that this kind of electric vehicles should emit. I see the discourse and the debate is mainly at the level of car makers and car owners. But what about the pedestrians, for example, that are in public spaces that need to, this kind of sounds in order to deambulate and navigate the urban space, also visually impaired people, for example. So I see here a lot of potential for more inclusive approaches to sound design for electric vehicles.
So, we need to include more people and more variety of people in designing the soundscapes of the future. So, but we can also use hard architecture. We can also use technology. There's a variety of ways that we can shape sound in our cities. Talk about one or two that you might have come across that you think are promising. Because some of them are very, very traditional, like trees to muffle sound or bringing the sound of water back into cities. But can we use more advanced technology? Everything's going to be digitized. How will that change our urban experience and sound? And Antonella or Dan?
I'll start with it. I think he said trees, as we know, can scatter sound, they can muffle sound, they can shape sound. Different tree species do different things, and again, that means a much more holistic approach where we're understanding the value of a tree generally, which is doing about 1 million other things for us as well. So it's possibly worth thinking about that a little bit along, as Antonella has just said, a sort of pedestrian-centered approach to the sound, a tree-centered approach to the street design would help us in numerous ways there. And then we're left with the buildings around us, and they too can shape the way that sound works. And we're increasingly shifting towards timber buildings, perhaps thinner buildings. If we reduce street noise, for instance, we can begin to reduce the amount of sound insulation that buildings need in the first place, which makes them cheaper and perhaps lighter and more adaptable, which you then enable a more flexible architecture. And we don't really realize how much of the architecture of our city is heavy and hard to block out sound, because originally it was factories and then it was the traffic noise. So there's a much more sort of lightweight architecture that's possible there, which is interesting to think about. And then finally, I'd say I went to a lab in Finland many years ago, which struck me, which was a nanocellulose lab, which was looking at using cellulose-based but re-engineering the atomic scale, essentially nanotechnology approach to re-engineering wood. And with that material, you can do almost anything you like in terms of moving sound, deflecting sound, amplifying, muffling. It can also conduct electricity. It can transmit Wi-Fi all through the material of the building itself. So there's something out there which is a very interesting sort of forward-looking vision. Again, it still has the tree at the heart of it, interestingly, but it's an entirely new material set of properties around nanocellulose. And then in the short term, we have cellulose as we understand it, timber buildings, streets defined by trees. All of those things would give us a far more harmonious soundscape.
Okay, so wood in all its varieties and lovely forms as a solution. Antonella, you're an architect. Other ways we might design our buildings, think about building shape and streetscapes and so on to make better sounding cities?
Yes, absolutely. There is a very interesting book which is called Guide to Everyday Sounds, which was published by researchers, Aguillard, for example, François Aguillard. And in this book, they show a lot of examples about how we can play with block morphology in order to manipulate and design our soundscapes. For example, the way we design the facades of buildings can have a huge impact on the sounds of the streets. So whether the facades have balconies or not can really manipulate the acoustic environment and amplify or not the sounds which are at the street level. And also the way we design courtyards as well can have a huge impact. But again, as Dan mentioned, what we really need perhaps it's a holistic approach to urban design and planning. Whether these will happen at the street scale, at the neighborhood scale, or at the city scale, but we really need to recover this sensitive ability to think holistically.
I think all of those scales are interlinked as well, aren't they? Which is so the 1 minute city we talk about, of the courtyard and the balcony and the streetscape, and these you can sense, Peter, that we're conjuring this idea of a sort of super convivial, very biodiverse green environment, which is built out of its character at the street scale, at 1 minute city scale, and that sits within 15-minute cities, as Carlos Moreno would say, which is then how you organize neighborhood amenities and things like this. And they sit within maybe 30 or 60-minute cities, which is how you organize things like subway systems. And so those things have been separated out awkwardly in the past, or all dealt with as if they're 60-minute city questions, like it's the subway. We'd plan that from above. Yeah. I think what Antonella is talking about, which I really love, is we need to get down to the scale of the balcony. For the balcony-shaped question, it's a balcony question, and that we can talk about in terms of its biodiversity, its local character. We can work with people at that scale and multiply that, so you have a city built up of all of those small, quiet moments. I think weirdly, Tokyo, which isn't maybe the first thing that springs to mind for many people when you think of a sustainable City, but I'd argue it actually is in many ways. And Tokyo back streets, once you get past the kind of subway station, they're really lovely and small and quiet. There's no on-street parking in Tokyo since 1965, so they're completely bereft of cars there usually. And they are small, quiet, sort of intimate, what Hermann Hertzberger called almost like cupboardness, like kangaroo spaces, these almost like pockets. And yet they sit within the largest urban region in the world. So it's both massive at that scale and super quiet and convivial at the small scale.
And also super dense, because I think the one thing that worries planners and thinking about sound is our cities will get denser, and we want to move people back into city centres where the nightclubs and the street noise is there, and all these kind of contested spaces around sound. But Tokyo seems to be solving that as a very dense, incredibly dense city. But is it because it's just quite monocultural, or is it about respect in a way of life? I
think that absolutely the culture plays out there, which is interesting. I mean, it's relatively diverse as well at that scale, but it has a defined culture, and Japanese culture is of course very Japanese. But it's those things are important, and I suppose that's what Antonella and I and you are all getting at, is the culture of the place is what needs to speak most strongly, whether that's Milan or Malmö or Tokyo, you know, it has an identity. And so the streets play out in Tokyo in a certain way. You know, people laugh, you can drop your wallet in the street at 9 o'clock in the morning. It'll still be there at 5 o'clock when you get home. You can pick it up again. But that's partly to do with the culture. But it's also to do with the way that Tokyo works. It has this almost, they talk about it as a metabolism. It's not really planned, actually. There is some vague planning, but most of it is happening at this metabolistic kind of organic scale, constantly moving. And every building lasting no longer than about 25 years, which is problematic in some other ways, but that enables this sense of change and the neighborhood continually refining and people being part of that. So there is this sense of scale and intimacy, and the architecture plays to that, and the culture is part of that as well. But it's a pattern that can multiply more like a metabolism than a top-down plan. And I think that's why it works.
Yeah. But Antonella, do you not think our cities will also become more multicultural? You know, because people are on the move and will be on the move more, we think, in the future. And so you can understand a city identity and its noises when it's, you know, a lovely Italian hill town with the, you know, the bells ringing out and so on. But if multiple cultures who all have their own sense of what good sound is it going to cause conflict? And who will decide whose sound is the right one for a place?
Yeah, this is a super interesting question, and I guess a very timely one as well. And for example, here in Berlin, the Club Commission has conducted a very interesting pilot study addressing the right to party versus the right to quietness. So they came up with a methodology based on qualitative and quantitative criteria, which is able to select open and public spaces throughout the city where open-air concerts can be run without disturbing the neighbors and the local residents. And in this way, they're able, you know, to respect the right to party for the clubbers and people who love dancing and listening to loud music, and people who like living more quietly or not being so much disturbed by music. And so this example shows that it's possible to respect the rights and you know, the preferences of different social groups, and this can happen in situated practices through democratic processes.
Brilliant, brilliant. So I want you both to kind of cast your minds and eyes and ears to the future. And so 20 years hence to 30 years hence, you've been helping design your cities and shape this future. What would be your kind of utopia of a kind of urban soundscape? What would you love to hear in the future in our cities? And I'm going to go to Dan first and then to Antonella.
Utopia is such a loaded term, but I think if I think of the street, which is where I usually start, I started at that scale. There is it's almost like hearing life would be my kind of starting point. And that life could be the sound of birds and birdsong, or it could be the sound of a coffee machine, or as you said, the church bells ringing, or kindergarten kids playing. So this is a funny thing about, you know, when we talk about the future. You could equally listen to what I just said and imagine, again, Milan in 1920 or a city from 1600 almost. So what I'm looking for is that the intrusive noises of the mid to late 20th century that have dominated the spaces, those are the ones that are disappearing, and they let life shine through. And that life has to be, as we know for various other reasons, defined around biodiversity and a kind of regenerative growth pattern. So hugely oriented around biodiversity. I think there's something interesting here. I was working with a project called Bee Urban, who are introducing bees back into cities. That's their thing. And Josephine, who runs that here, pointed out that Swedish bees quite like streets, it turns out, because over centuries they've sort of trained to understand that where the farmers' fields meet the forest is a straight line, and that's the most biodiverse spot. That's really good for pollinators. So Swedish bees have been sort of wiggling around, but they're flying in straight lines now, more or less, because of the grid pattern of fields. And so strangely, they might be appropriate for a bee-centered redesign of cities. And so my starting point is, what would this biodiversity be like if we looked at streets in a way that enable biodiversity to spring out, and humans as part of that, because we're just part of nature. And so our noises of coffee machines and church bells and someone playing music or kids running around in a playground, they're counterpointed by the rest of nature. But what disappears there, as you can tell, is the car, the heavy truck, the sounds of the heavy industry and everything that goes along with that. So those fade away, and life comes forward, and that would be my starting point.
Fantastic, lovely. Antonella, what's your vision of a future soundscape?
Here, to me, the point is not only how future cities will sound, but how future cities will be, in fact, as Dan was mentioning. So what we really need is to rethink of new models for just and sustainable places. Otherwise, I'm afraid that considering the climate change challenges we face, future sounds could be only those of nature, because humans will disappear.
Lovely. So thank you for that future vision. I kind of can't help thinking in the future that there will still be lots of sounds and noises in cities. And at the moment, it's kind of quite chaotic and unregulated. And I don't think it should necessarily be regulated, but my vision would be of a city that is orchestrated in terms of making sounds beautiful and sensual, and part of identity. It might be the call to prayer of a mosque, it might be church bells, and it might be some music. So somebody's thinking about how all those sounds fit together, but not one planner. That thinking, it needs to happen from the whole city and the whole community. What you talked about as the kind of participatory approach to this. So I loved it, Dan. Bringing life. Letting us hear life in the city, and thinking about who defines that, as you said, Antonella, and the whole kind of sense of city belonging to all of us. So thank you so much, both of you, for guiding us so well into sound and the future of sound. If you want to hear more and join more events in the Festival of the Future City, the link will be below this video, and please join us. So I just want to thank you both once again, and I can say goodbye and sign off from Bristol.
I'll say hej då from Stockholm.
Ciao from Berlin.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.